Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back into the studio for another questions and answers video, with the larger Kronos being sculpted in the background. Let's get into it. First, let me address the way that I'm working here and the way that I'll probably continue to work on this sculpture into the near future. You can see the in-progress maquette on the left side of the screen. This maquette is now finished and in the process of being molded and cast. And once that happens, the cast will serve the same purpose as what the clay does here. So what I eventually realized is that this sculpture is too big and things require too much manual labor for it to be cost effective to work from a model. In order to make working with a model an effective approach here, I need to observe the model and then execute my observation in clay. This is problematic because any execution on this large of a scale takes so freaking long because of how big the sculpture is. That's part of the practical aspect of this consideration. The maquette and the sculpture I want to make moved away from the model so far that I don't think a model is going to be practical, or the model that I had is going to be practical anymore. The pose is somewhat different from what he can hold for a prolonged period of time. The proportions are quite different as well. And I want a very different portrait on this sculpture than the one that my model has. The maquette, now that it is finished, is quite well rendered and represents more of what I want than what the model provides. So I've decided to push forward without a model, working like this video today from the maquette. There are dangers involved in doing so, however, that I certainly should mention, working from a maquette that is. What functions well in third scale might not work out in the larger scale version. There could be small issues with the proportions, for example, that will only grow bigger and more apparent in a larger scale sculpture. So it's not without danger and potential pitfalls. I have to pay close attention and watch out for these. I've never done anything like this, so I'm not entirely sure, if I'm being honest, I'm not entirely sure if this will work out. I'm hoping and I believe that it will work, and you can subscribe and follow along and you'll get to see for yourself if it will work or not. Let me quickly, before we move on to questions, mention the audio change that I've made to the channel. I've decided to test out using the studio audio as the background instead of background music. You can let me know what you think about this change in the comments below. If you like it or if you dislike it, let me know. I'd love to hear from you. I couldn't answer every question that I got this time around, and I never seem to be able to, but I'll keep the ones that I didn't get to answer in my questions folder, and they will be answered in a future video. So do not despair if your question is not answered today. You can always join my Patreon as well and have them answered whenever you like. Link in the description below. First question today is about the butterflies, or clothespins, as they are known to most people. What purpose do they serve, etc. The purpose the butterflies serve is to support the clay. I can't have thick armature wire everywhere, and wire is also very hard to move around because of how thick the wire I use is. It's very stiff. So it's much easier to have a butterfly suspended on a wire hanging from the armature. The wire has to be tight in order for the butterfly to be effective. It supports the clay and gives it something to grab onto in areas where there is a lot of clay hanging far away from the armature. Like under the armpits, for example, or underneath the thighs. Butterflies are very useful because they are so flexible and can be moved wherever I need them to, whenever I need them to. And should they end up in the wrong place, I can push them around very easily. I can push them into the clay, for example, if they end up being too close to the surface and impeding my modeling. Now, personally, I like having them everywhere, and probably having too many rather than too little. Now, it makes getting the clay off the armature after I make the mold a bit of a pain in the ass, but that's a cheap price to pay for good clay support, I think. Another armature related question here. Where do I get armature wire from? What is the wire made out of? And how do I choose what thickness of wire to use? I get the armature wire from a place in the UK called Toronto. I order it in bulk and they ship it pretty quickly. And they ship all over Europe, I think. Usually most art supply stores will have some selection of armature wire, but it can be sometimes hard to come by the correct size and also the correct type of armature wire, the good stuff. The good stuff is aluminum armature wire. Aluminum is what we in Norway call a dead metal, which means that it won't retain any memory of its former shape and won't spring back to where it once was. In other words, it bends nicely and stays bent exactly as you wish. I prefer the square wire as I imagine it has a slightly easier time holding onto the clay compared to the round one, and I have nothing but intuition to back this statement up. The thickness of wire to choose is to me a question of flexibility versus stability. You want a wire that's thin enough to fit inside your sculpture, of course, yet thick enough to support the weight of the clay you intend to put on it. There are too many factors that determine whether the wire can support the weight of the clay or not to be able to calculate in any way with any confidence at least. So I make my choice of wire based on experience and, frankly, just stomach feel. If the wire can't support the weight of the clay, for some reason, which does happen from time to time, sometimes I guess wrong, I add external support in some fashion later on. As you can see, there's still a lot of exposed wire visible on this figure. And as you can see, it's actually two armature wires attached together with hose clamps. And I did this for extra strength, but also to take up a little bit more space inside the sculpture, which means less clay, which in turn means less weight. Okay, next question. When did you realize you wanted to make sculpting your career? I think the second I realized that sculpting was a possible career choice, I wanted to make it a career. After I realized that I actually liked sculpture, of course. And that happened pretty much right as I realized that I could make sculptures out of clay at all, right after I tried it. Even though I had really no idea how to do it. The first sculptures that piqued my interest was sculpture from Hollywood effects houses, maquettes for movies, prosthetic makeup sculptures, and stuff like that. So, in the beginning I was thinking that I would try to head down that path. Norway, however, is very far from Hollywood, and I had no idea where to even begin approaching a career as a Hollywood sculptor. So what I decided to do was to simply try to get better at sculpting first and then kind of see where that led me, hoping that it would lead me somewhere. Everyone that I would ever see talking about sculptures for movies would mention that if you could sculpt a human body, you could sculpt anything. Or starting with the human body and doing a good job of it, creating a convincing human, would propel you forward to do other, more monster-like things. So what that did was it sent me down the path of attempting to get better at figurative sculpture, human figurative sculpture. And eventually I had two competing interests and limited time to practice. So at some point I abandoned the idea of becoming a monster maker and instead leaned heavily into getting better at figurative work. Focusing on one thing, narrowing the aperture, definitely sets things into focus. And I was lucky enough to be able to attend the Florence Academy of Art, where I got to really dive deep into a narrow subject and get a lot better. And perhaps even good. It can be really hard to make a career out of sculpting on its own. Just selling work can be very unreliable at times and definitely has been for me. Which is why I think having several streams of revenue, several streams of income is helpful for any artist in any field. Becoming proficient enough to be able to teach your art form to others is of great help, of course, and perhaps sharing the process like I'm doing here is another way for many people to gain some additional income. Next question. Is it too late to start with art now that I'm older? And I'm not going to specify how old this person was, but that doesn't really matter. I don't think it's ever too late to start making art. I didn't really start out that young myself. I don't think I ever even thought of being an artist until I turned 20 years old. My first proper and meaningful encounter with art was in Rome in 2010, and for some reason I started thinking that this looked pretty cool, looked like an interesting thing to attempt myself, looking at, Renaissance paintings and stuff like that. Perhaps something that I could attempt to make a career out of. Which is a pretty naive thing to think after seeing some Renaissance painting, deciding you wanting to get into the arts. But I think being young and naive and a little bit stubborn is always a good place to start, no matter what you're attempting to become. So I started art college with no artistic experience at all, other than making model airplanes and painting Warhammer figures, so it wasn't exactly a very promising start. It took me probably until the spring term of my first year before I even attempted to make a sculpture during a project that had us create some sort of work with the human body as the subject. I don't think I showed an excess of promise right out of the gate, and for quite a while I probably didn't work that hard or as hard as I should have in order to become pretty good either. But once I kind of doubled down and put myself in a place where dedication came easy, or rather dedication was simply part of what was needed to succeed at this place, then things started to slowly come together. And that place was, of course, the Florence Academy of Art. I think it's never too late to start. Once you start, however, you have to dedicate yourself to learning in order to become any better, and you have to take on the role of the student, the idiot, if you will. I'm not entirely sure how I feel about talent, or the idea of people having talent. I think it's probably more about whether you are good at learning and put in the hours to not only learn, but to be able to execute. And if you have a bit of talent as well, that probably just expedites that process. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, consider liking it and subscribing to the channel for more videos. I put out a new video every Thursday, so stay tuned for next week. If you want to support the channel, visit the link to my Patreon page in the description below to learn how. Thank you for watching, stay creative, and I hope to see you in the next one.